Garrett Hayes had done close protection work for 8 years before accepting the Thessaran contract, and in that time he'd learned one universal truth. Clients who treated security like furniture were usually the ones who needed protection most. They lived in carefully maintained bubbles where threat was abstract concept rather than immediate danger, and they resented anyone whose presence suggested those bubbles might not be impermeable. Princess Kira Valen was a textbook example. "Tell me again why I require a human guard," she said during their first formal meeting, not bothering to look at Garrett directly. She stood at the window of her private chambers in the imperial palace, watching gardens below with studied disinterest. "When we have an entire military force of our own people who actually understand Thessaran security protocols. Your Highness, the recent reorganization of palace security has created temporary staffing gaps," her chief of household explained patiently. He was an older Thessaran named Vex, and his lavender skin displayed diplomatic beiges that Garrett's cultural training identified as careful patience. Contracted security specialists are filling those gaps while permanent assignments are finalized. How efficient? Kira's tone made clear what she thought of efficiency that involved humans. She finally turned to look at Garrett, her pointed ears tilted in expression that translated roughly as disdain. "And you are qualified for this assignment how?" "8 years close protection experience, ma'am," Garrett replied with professional neutrality. "Corporate executives, diplomatic personnel, private clients in high-risk environments. Standard threat assessment, defensive tactics, crisis management training." "Corporate executives," Kira repeated. "How prestigious. I am third in line to the imperial throne, not a businessman worried about industrial espionage." "The principles of close protection are consistent regardless of client background," Garrett said. "My job is to identify threats and keep you safe from them. I have been safe my entire life without assistance from your species. I suspect I will continue to be safe regardless of whether you stand in my corridors looking stern." Vex's skin flickered to warning oranges. "Your Highness, the security reorganization is necessary due to credible threats." "Credible threats against my siblings," Kira interrupted, "who are actually important enough to target. I am third in line, Vex. Not significant enough to assassinate, not influential enough to be worth kidnapping. This entire protection detail is performative nonsense, and assigning me a human just emphasizes how little the actual security command cares about this assignment." Garrett said nothing. He'd heard variations of this speech before, from executives who thought their competitors were too sophisticated for violence, from diplomats who believed their neutrality made them untouchable, from private clients who wanted protection but resented acknowledging they needed it. Let them talk. His job was keeping them alive regardless of their opinions about whether that job was necessary. "You may stand outside my chambers," Kira said dismissively. "Try not to make our household staff uncomfortable with your presence. I understand some species find humans unsettling." "I'll do my best, ma'am," Garrett replied, recognizing dismissal when he heard it. He took up position in the corridor outside Kira's private chambers, settling into the alert but patient state that characterized professional protection work. Hours of watchful waiting punctuated by brief moments of action. That was the job description. Most people couldn't handle the boredom. Garrett had always found it meditative. Over the following days, he learned the rhythms of Kira's household and schedule. Morning audiences with petitioners seeking royal favor, afternoon study sessions with tutors covering political theory and historical precedent, evening social events where she performed the role of charming princess for court observers. She was good at the performance, witty without being threatening, beautiful without being ostentatious, politically aware without appearing ambitious. But Garrett also noticed what happened between performances. The way Kira's confident bearing deflated when she returned to her chambers after audiences, where most petitioners clearly wanted access to her more important siblings. The way she dismissed servants with unnecessarily harsh words after social events, where nobles paid her just enough attention to be polite. The way she stood at her window late at night, staring at palace gardens like she was prisoner rather than princess. Third in line. Important enough to have responsibilities, not important enough to have real power. Visible enough to be scrutinized, not significant enough to be truly respected. It was the worst kind of position, too much status to be free, not enough status to be secure. "Does it bother you?" Kira asked one evening, surprising Garrett by actually addressing him directly. She'd been particularly harsh with servants that day after an audience where multiple nobles had asked if her older sister might grant them meetings. "Does what bother me, ma'am? Standing here, watching me perform my meaningless routines. Protecting someone who doesn't matter." She was still performing, he noticed. The self-deprecation was calculated, designed to elicit disagreement or sympathy. "I was hired to protect you," Garrett said simply. "Whether you matter is not my concern." The response clearly wasn't what she'd expected. Her lavender skin flickered to confused greens. "How?" Refreshingly blunt. "You asked a question. I answered honestly. Most people would have assured me I do matter, that my position is significant, that I'm valued." Her tone was mocking, but underneath it Garrett heard something more genuine, curiosity about why he hadn't followed that script. "Would you have believed them if they had?" Kira was quiet for a moment. "No," she finally admitted. "But they would have said it anyway. That's how this works. Everyone performs their role, pretends everyone else's role matters, maintains the comfortable fiction that we're all important in our own ways." "I'm not here to perform roles or maintain fictions," Garrett said. "I'm here to keep you alive. Everything else is secondary." "How terribly simple your worldview must be." "Simplicity has advantages, fewer complications." She laughed, but it wasn't entirely mocking. "Perhaps, but I suspect you'll find our court is nothing but complications. And you, standing there with your uncomplicated human certainty about duties and responsibilities, are going to be very confused when those complications inevitably arrive." "I'll manage, ma'am." "I'm sure you think so." She returned to looking out her window. "But loyalty is transactional here, Garrett Hayes. People stay as long as advantage exists. The moment staying becomes costly, they leave. That's not cruelty, it's rational self-interest. You do well to remember that before you invest too heavily in your simple worldview about protecting people regardless of circumstances." "I'll keep that in mind," Garrett said neutrally. He didn't mention that he'd heard similar warnings before from clients who assumed everyone operated by their cultural rules, or that those warnings usually came from people who desperately wanted to believe loyalty was always transactional so they wouldn't have to confront evidence otherwise. The political situation began deteriorating 2 weeks into Garrett's assignment. Tensions between noble factions that had been simmering for years suddenly escalated. Accusations of corruption, challenges to policy decisions, barely disguised threats exchanged in public forums. The palace security reorganization that had necessitated contracted guards wasn't just administrative efficiency. It was response to credible intelligence about internal threats. Kira seemed oblivious to the danger. Or perhaps she decided that since threats were aimed at her siblings, they weren't her concern. "The first and second heirs have doubled their security details," Vex mentioned during one morning briefing. His skin was displaying warning reds that suggested genuine concern. "How nice for them," Kira said, reviewing correspondence without looking up. "I'm sure they'll feel very important surrounded by excessive protection." "Your Highness, the threats are credible. You should consider increasing your own security protocols." "I have Garrett Hayes standing in my corridor. I'm sure he's worth at least half a dozen Thessaran soldiers with his uncomplicated human dedication to duty." Her tone was mocking, but Garrett noticed she glanced at him briefly while saying it, checking his reaction. "I would recommend additional personnel regardless," Vex pressed. "No." Kira set down her correspondence. I will not cower behind excessive security and confirm everyone's assessment that I'm irrelevant enough to be frightened. The threats are aimed at my siblings. I am third in line. No one cares enough about me to bother. Vex's skin flickered to frustrated oranges, but he didn't argue further. After he left, Kira looked at Garrett directly. You think I'm being foolish, risking my safety because of pride? I think you're the client and I'm the guard, Garrett replied. My opinion about your decisions isn't relevant, but you have one. I always do, part of the job, and I think people who believe they're too unimportant to target usually learn otherwise at inconvenient times. But like I said, you're the client. I follow your decisions. Even when my decisions are driven by pride and denial. Especially then, that's usually when clients need protection most. Kira's expression was unreadable. You are either very wise or very stupid, Garrett Hayes. I have not yet determined which. Most days I'm not sure either, ma'am. She laughed, genuinely this time, not the performative sound she used in court. Well, at least you're honest about it. 3 days later, everything fell apart. The coup attempt began at dawn. Garrett was already at his post outside Kira's chambers. He preferred early shifts when the palace was quiet and threat assessment was simpler. The first indication something was wrong came through his earpiece. Security channels suddenly flooding with urgent chatter. Reports of unauthorized personnel in restricted areas. Then the unmistakable sound of weapons fire echoing through palace corridors. Garrett was through Kira's door before the echo faded, weapon drawn, scanning for immediate threats. Kira sat up in her bed, confused and disoriented. What? We have a security breach. Get dressed, something practical, 2 minutes. Garrett moved to the window, checking external approaches while pulling up security feeds on his wrist display. What he saw made his blood cold. Coordinated assault, multiple entry points, professional tactics. This wasn't amateur hour. We need to move now. What's happening? Kira was out of bed, fumbling with clothing, her skin cycling through confused grays and frightened whites. Palace is under attack. Noble faction attempting coup by the look of it. First and second heirs are priority targets. Garrett checked the corridor, still clear for now. Which makes you valuable secondary target for leverage. We need to get you somewhere defensible until loyalist forces regain control. My guards are either fighting elsewhere or fled. We're it. Garrett pulled up building schematics. There's an auxiliary residence in the East Wing, designed as refuge for exactly this scenario. Defensible position, independent supplies, hardened security. We go there locked down, wait for situation to resolve. That's on the other side of the palace. I know, which is why we move now, while attackers are still focused on primary objectives. Garrett checked his weapon loadout, grabbed the emergency kit he'd kept in Kira's antechamber against exactly this scenario. Stay behind me, do exactly what I say, and we'll get through this. They moved through palace corridors that were usually pristine and controlled but now echoed with distant combat, emergency alarms, the chaos of institutional order breaking down. Garrett navigated via routes that prioritized cover over speed, checking corners, avoiding areas where security feeds showed hostile activity. Twice they encountered other people fleeing, servants, minor nobles, household staff all abandoning posts and running for whatever exit seemed safest. None stopped to help. None offered to travel together, just panicked individuals prioritizing their own survival. So much for loyalty, Kira muttered as another group of her household staff ran past without acknowledging her. Fear makes philosophers of us all, Garrett replied, keeping his attention on the corridor ahead. Most loyalty is contingent on circumstances being tolerable. When circumstances stop being tolerable, contingencies activate. You're still here. I'm paid for this. No amount of payment is worth dying for someone else. I didn't say it was, but I took the contract knowing the risk. Leaving because the risk became real would defeat the entire purpose. Garrett signaled for her to stop, checking an intersection before waving her forward. Besides, we're not dying today. Not if I can help it. They reached the auxiliary residence 45 minutes later, a smaller complex within the palace grounds, designed during more paranoid periods of Thessaran history when royal family members needed secure refuges during internal conflicts. Garrett got Kira inside, sealed the reinforced door, and immediately began checking defensive capabilities. The security system is still active, he reported, pulling up feeds that showed palace grounds swarming with hostile forces. We have independent power, water, provisions for about 2 weeks if rationed. Walls are hardened against most portable weapons. Communications are down palace-wide, but I've got satellite backup we can use once situation stabilizes. Kira sat on a bench watching him work, her skin still displaying frightened whites. How long will we be here? Depends on how fast loyalist forces respond. Could be hours, could be days. Garrett finished his security check and faced her directly. I'll be honest, this is defensible position but not impregnable. If they figure out you're here and decide you're worth the effort to extract, we'll have a fight on our hands. Can you hold them? For a while, long enough for help to arrive, probably, maybe. He checked his weapon again, more from habit than necessity. But it might get worse before it gets better. I notice you're not promising everything will be fine. I don't make promises I can't keep. How refreshingly terrible your bedside manner is. Despite the situation, Garrett smiled. I'm a guard, not a therapist. You want comforting lies, I'm the wrong person. Apparently I want truth that makes me wish for comforting lies. Kira's skin flickered to something between fear and dark humor. This was not how I expected my week to progress. Rarely is. Garrett settled into monitoring position, watching security feeds while staying alert for external threats. Get some rest if you can. Going to be a long wait. The first day passed in tense stillness. They watched through security feeds as battle raged across the palace grounds. Loyalist forces fighting to retake control. Coup forces trying to consolidate power. Chaos that wouldn't resolve quickly or cleanly. Garrett rationed their supplies carefully, maintained defensive preparations, and kept Kira away from windows and potential firing lines. On the second day, word came through intercepted communications that the first and second heirs had survived assassination attempts. Heavy security had protected them, evacuated them to secure locations, ensured succession would continue even if the coup succeeded temporarily. They're safe, Kira said, listening to the reports. Of course they are. Surrounded by dozens of guards, protected by every resource the Empire can marshal. That's appropriate given their position, Garrett said. Yes, appropriate. Kira's skin flickered to bitter purples. And I'm here, defended by one human contractor who was assigned to me because I was low priority enough that anyone would do. I'm here because I was assigned. Why I was assigned doesn't change the assignment. It changes what it means. She turned away from the security feeds. Everyone else ran. My household staff, my supposed allies at court, even the nobles who swore loyalty just weeks ago, all of them prioritized their own safety the moment danger became real. You're the only one who stayed, and you stayed because of contract obligation, not because you care whether I live or die. That's true, Garrett agreed. I don't know you well enough to have personal investment in your survival beyond professional duty. Thank you for your honesty. But, Garrett continued, professional duty still requires me to keep you alive. Whether I care personally is irrelevant to whether I'll do my job. You can resent that it's just a job if you want, but functionally it produces the same outcome as personal loyalty. I stay, I protect you. I don't abandon my post when circumstances get difficult. Kira looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. That is either very comforting or deeply depressing. I haven't decided which. Doesn't have to be either. It's just reality. You humans have very strange relationship with reality. So we're told. On the third day, Kira's composure began cracking more visibly. The feeds showed continuing combat, showed her household completely scattered, showed the brutal reality that her position in the succession made her just valuable enough to be leverage but not valuable enough to prioritize protecting. "I want to send a message," she said suddenly, "to my siblings, to Loyalist Command, to anyone who might send help. Communications are still compromised," Garrett said. "Anything we send could be intercepted, could give away our position. So I just sit here hoping someone eventually remembers I exist. You sit here staying alive until the situation resolves. That's the priority." Easy for you to say. You don't have to confront the reality that your own family considers you expendable. "I confronted that reality when I was 17 and joined the military," Garrett said quietly. "Family, government, command structure, they all considered me expendable. Most people are expendable from institutional perspectives. Coming to terms with that is part of growing up." Kira stared at him. "That's bleak. That's honest. Institutions optimize for institutional survival. Individuals within those institutions are variables, not constants. Once you accept that, you can decide what kind of variable you want to be. And what kind did you decide to be? The kind that does the job regardless of whether institutions value it. I can't control how I'm perceived or valued. I can control whether I follow through on commitments." "That seems exhausting." "Sometimes," Garrett admitted. "But it's also simple. I know what I'm supposed to do. I do it. Everything else is noise." On the fourth day, intelligence reports intercepted through Garrett's satellite backup indicated that rebel forces had identified Kira's location and were planning an assault. They'd secured most of the palace and wanted to capture all remaining royal family members to maximize political leverage. Garrett assessed their defensive position honestly and didn't like the conclusions. "They know we're here. They're organizing a proper assault, not just probing. We can hold for several hours if we're lucky, but if Loyalist forces don't arrive in time, we surrender or die," Kira finished. "Essentially." She stood at the window. Garrett had warned her against it multiple times, but she seemed to have stopped caring. "I always thought when death came for me, it would be dignified. Assassination from professional killers sent by serious enemies, or natural causes in old age. Not captured by rebels as political leverage, because I'm valuable enough to be worth taking but not valuable enough to properly protect. You're not dead yet, but I will be, or I'll be captured, which might be worse." She turned to face him, and her skin was displaying colors Garrett had never seen, raw terror mixed with dark acceptance. "Everyone who swore loyalty abandoned me the moment it cost them anything to stay. My household, my allies, even my family prioritized other concerns. You're the only one who remained, and you remained because of contract obligation, not because I matter. I remained because I said I would, which is loyalty for pay rather than loyalty from choice, which somehow makes it more honest and more depressing simultaneously." Kira moved away from the window. "Our culture values transactional relationships because at least transactions are honest. You know where you stand. Benefit exceeds cost, people stay. Cost exceeds benefit, people leave. Clean mathematics. Until someone stays anyway. Until someone stays anyway," she agreed. "Which disrupts the mathematics and forces me to wonder whether I've understood anything correctly about how relationships work." She looked at Garrett with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. Then deliberately she began removing her formal robes, the elaborate garments that signaled her status and rank. "What are you doing?" Garrett asked. "Testing something." Kira removed layer after layer until she stood before him in simple undergarments that would have been modest by human standards, but left her completely vulnerable by Thessaran cultural norms. "In our culture, seeing royalty without status symbols is intimacy reserved for absolute trust. I'm asking you a question without words. Will you stay when I have nothing? No status, no reward, no reason for you to care." Garrett looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, processed what she was asking, and responded with absolute honesty. "You should put something more practical on. If we need to move quickly, those formal robes will slow you down. There's tactical gear in the storage room that would be better for emergency evacuation. He turned back to his security monitors without further comment. Behind him, Kira made a sound that might have been laugh or sob or both. You didn't even react. I reacted practically. You were wearing impractical clothing for our tactical situation. I addressed that concern. I just stripped myself of every symbol of rank and protection, made myself completely vulnerable by cultural standards, and you responded by suggesting better clothing choices. Did you want different response? Kira was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, less performative, more genuinely uncertain. I don't know. I've spent my entire life in a culture where vulnerability is always used against you, where showing weakness is invitation for exploitation. You looked at me without any protection, and your only concern was practical optimization of our defensive situation. That's my job. It shouldn't be this simple. Why not? Because loyalty is supposed to be transactional. People stay when benefit exceeds cost. They leave when cost exceeds benefit. You're staying in a situation where cost is potentially your life, where benefit is a paycheck you might not live to collect, and you're doing it without even acknowledging that you're making an irrational choice. I don't think it's irrational, Garrett said calmly. I committed to protecting you. That commitment doesn't stop being valid because circumstances changed. Following through on commitments regardless of changing costs is just how commitments work. That's not how anything works in rational society. Then I guess I'm not rational by your society's standards. Garrett checked his weapon loadout, preparing for the assault he knew was coming. But I'm still here. And I'm still going to keep you alive if I possibly can. You can spend our remaining time analyzing the sociological implications of that, or you can put on practical clothing and help me prepare defensive positions. Your choice. Kira stared at him for another long moment. Then, without words, she went to the storage room and found the tactical gear Garrett had mentioned. When she emerged wearing it, she looked different, less like a princess performing role, more like a person facing reality without the comfortable insulation of status. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For staying when everyone else left. It's my job, Garrett replied, but this time he added, but you're welcome anyway. 6 hours later, the assault began. The first indication of the assault was the security system registering forced entry attempts at 3 separate access points, coordinated attack designed to divide defenders' attention. Garrett had anticipated this. He'd spent the previous hours preparing defensive positions, creating fallback points, turning the auxiliary residence into as much of a fortress as its design allowed. Stay in the inner chamber, he told Kira, handing her a backup weapon he'd kept in reserve. If they breach my positions and reach you, this is set to simple point-and-shoot operation. Aim center mass, squeeze trigger, keep squeezing until threats stop moving. You're talking like you expect them to get past you. I'm talking like someone who prepares for contingencies. Garrett checked his defensive position one final time. They're professionals, I'm one person, the mathematics aren't favorable, but I can make them pay for every meter they advance. That buys time for loyalist forces to arrive. And if loyalist forces don't arrive, then we improvise. He met her eyes directly. I'm not going to lie and say this will definitely work out, but I'm going to make it as expensive as possible for them to reach you. That's all I can promise. It's more than anyone else promised, Kira said quietly. The assault began in earnest 20 minutes later. Rebels breached the outer perimeter with professional efficiency, shaped charges on reinforced doors, tactical entry patterns, suppressing fire that forced Garrett to stay behind cover. He responded methodically, using prepared positions and defensive advantages to maximum effect. This wasn't about heroics or dramatic stands. It was about making every advance cost them time and resources. The first assault wave withdrew after 12 minutes, having advanced only 20 meters while losing 3 operatives to Garrett's defensive fire. They'd expected minimal resistance, maybe one guard who'd surrender immediately when faced with superior numbers. Instead, they found prepared defensive positions and someone who knew what he was doing. Garrett used the lull to relocate to his secondary position, knowing they'd be ready for his primary location on the next assault. He checked his ammunition, down to 60% already. Not great, but manageable if he stayed disciplined with his fire control. The second assault came 30 minutes later with better tactics, smoke grenades to obscure his firing lines, suppressing fire from multiple angles, coordinated advances that forced him to choose which threat to engage. Garrett fell back to his third position, still exacting cost for every meter they gained but unable to stop the advance entirely. "They're getting closer," Kira called from the inner chamber, and Garrett could hear the fear in her voice. "I know," he called back, dropping another attacker with carefully aimed fire, still making them work for it. The third assault pushed him all the way back to the final defensive position, just outside the inner chamber where Kira waited. Garrett was bleeding from debris wounds, down to 30% ammunition, and facing attackers who now understood they were dealing with professional resistance. "Guard Hayes," a voice called out in Thessaran, amplified through external speakers. "You're defending a cause that's already lost. The palace is secured, the royal family captured or fled. Princess Kira is valuable to us as political leverage, but you are not. Surrender her custody and we'll allow you to leave unmolested." "Respectfully decline," Garrett called back, reloading his weapon behind cover. "You're human. This isn't your conflict. You have no stake in Thessaran politics or succession disputes. Why die for someone who means nothing to you?" "Contract obligation," Garrett replied, which was true but not the whole truth. Somewhere over the past days, Kira had become more than just another client. She'd become someone he actually respected for facing fear without the comfortable insulation of status, someone who'd tested him in the only way her culture understood, and accepted his response without demanding more than he could give. But saying all that to rebels while they were trying to kill him seemed unnecessarily personal, so he stuck with the simple answer. "That's insane," the voice responded. "No contract is worth dying for." "That's between me and my employer," Garrett called back, "but I appreciate your concern for my well-being." A grenade came through the doorway. Garrett kicked it back out before detonation, though the blast wave still hit him hard enough to leave his ears ringing. "Last chance, Guard Hayes. Surrender the princess and walk away." Garrett's response was a 3-round burst through the doorway that suggested his answer remained unchanged. The final assault came with overwhelming force. They'd committed serious resources now, determined to end this. Garrett held his position with methodical discipline, making every S